The third part of the lesson on preserving and reserving lights involves a number of supplies that are not on the watercolor jumpstart supply list because I normally provide some to share in class. If you're doing this exercise at home, you may do just the parts that you have the supplies for, or you may put this part of the lesson on hold until you have a chance to purchase these supplies. You'll need a 1/8 sheet of watercolor paper. And I've divided my sheet into 3 sections, 2 that are a little wider and 1 that can be somewhat narrower. In the narrow section, I'd like you to draw 2 circles using your favorite circle template. You could use a quarter or a $half or a dollar coin, but if you check your kitchen, you may have a circle template like mine in your spice rack. You'll also need some masking tape and a pair of scissors. I'm going to cut a little shape out of my masking tape. And just to keep things simple, I'm just going to make it a little bit of a triangular shape, kind of thinking, here's another way I could do that sail. So I have my little sail shape. When I use masking tape as a resist, I have to worry about the texture of the paper. The paint can creep underneath. So you want to burnish your tape down. Burnishing means to press it down firmly all the way around, and I usually use my fingernail to do this. Next, you'll need some wax. This is just ordinary paraffin that's used for canning and candles and so forth. And when you use wax as a resist, it's nice to sometimes just glide it over the paper, and if we're lucky, I've only hit the top of the bumps in the paper and we'll get an interesting texture. I can also use a corner to write with it, and I know that that's not very visible right now on the video, but once we put paint over it, we'll see it. This is a solid resist. Now we're ready to start applying our liquid resists. The one that most people know about is masking fluid, also called drawing gum or liquid Frisket. I like to use the brand PBO simply because, in my experience, it's one of the least likely to adhere to the paper and not be removable over time. I've left it on for quite a long time with no problem. It has a dark tint so that you can see that gray color. The natural color of liquid Frisket is the same ivory as the paper, but you don't want to shake it. Instead, you want to just roll it around to mix that in, and you hear that clunking noise? When I buy a new bottle of liquid Frisket, I drop a marble in the bottom, and that helps me mix that tint back in without shaking it. If you shake it, you'll make foam bubbles, and this is latex in solution and it coagulates. This one goes back and forth to class all the time, so it coagulates anyway, and you'll get these little blobs here of gooey stuff, and you just discard that. That cannot be dissolved again. I recommend you buy a small bottle because this does have a shelf life that's not terribly long, and I only use the big bottle because I bring it back and forth to class. Very important information about drawing gum. This is latex in solution. It's rubber. Once it dries, it cannot be removed without a lot of work from cloth or brushes. So you don't want to get it on your clothes, and you don't want to use your good brushes for this. So instead, most people like to have a brush they use just for masking fluid. And I want my masking fluid brushwork to look like all my other brushwork, so I use a decent quality synthetic brush. But in some way, mark it so that you know it's your masking brush and you use it only for masking fluid. When you're ready to use masking fluid, I like to pour a little bit out into a dish. If I try to dip my brush in, then there's a very good chance that I'll wind up with masking fluid up here on the ferrule. That's going to dry while I'm working and make a mess. So I like to use a little dish so that I don't dip my brush in so far. Also, to prevent the masking fluid from getting stuck in your brush, take your brush, get it wet, and scrub it on a bar of soap. I'm scrubbing it rather vigorously and getting plenty of soap in the bristles, especially back here by the ferrule. And then I just leave that soap in the brush, dip it in my masking fluid, and I use the masking fluid just like paint. So I can make all the usual brush marks that I could make with paint with my masking fluid, including some of those brush marks that we used in the project on Dawn and Dusk on the Lake, where we're making the suggestion of little grasses. I can also spatter with masking fluid to make little white lights. Every time I rinse my brush, I use my soap again. And then in this lower area, I'm going to paint a little section, sort of maybe an irregular blob. I have to let that dry, and then I'll show you what we're going to do with that next. In the upper part here, I have my wax resist. In the lower part, I'm going to try a few other brush shapes. Maybe I could splay my brushes out and make more of a fringy shape. So play around just as you did when we explored the various marks that our brushes would make, and see what marks your masking fluid brush will make. If I want some little tiny lines, I can take a sharp object such as my dip pen and drag masking fluid out from this puddle and make little spines here. You can also load your dip pen using your brush and use it to draw with the masking fluid. This doesn't work particularly well because it dries very fast on the dip pen, and I find I don't have much success with that. So if you want to make a lot of little lines, you can buy one of these little resist pens, or you can also buy these bottles empty and just fill them yourself. The nice thing about this version is inside the cap there's a wire, so that the wire keeps the tip open. It's always good to test these a little bit on another piece of paper. And then this is the best way to make a lot of little thin lines. Finally, in this section over here, I'm going to have you use gum arabic to fill this top circle so that we can compare it. We're going to use a different method. I'm sorry, we're using masking fluid up here. We're going to use a different method for this one so that we can compare the two. We're going to see when we remove this that masking fluid leaves a pretty hard edge, and that is one of the drawbacks to it. So I'm going to show you an alternate method which leaves a softer edge. When you're finished with your masking fluid, you can pour back whatever excess there was, and then simply allow this to dry in the dish, and you'll be able to peel it right out when it's dry. To compare with the masking fluid resist, I'm also going to use some gum arabic. Not as many people know about this, but this is the binder or glue in watercolor, and it's a water-soluble gum that remains soluble after it dries. It's the same gum that's used to make gummy bears. You can buy it already in liquid form. And then, just as with masking fluid, I like to put this in a little cup. And it's sort of the consistency of honey. This will not harm your watercolor brushes. You can use a good watercolor brush with this. But just to make sure I don't accidentally use my good brush with the masking fluid, I'm going to go ahead and use the same brush. And you want to put it on fairly thick. Don't thin it with water when you're using it as a resist. It has other uses, but for a resist, you need it fairly thick. Now I have to wait for everything to dry. Whenever I am completely done with masking fluid, I change my water and I put all of this away before I get my good brushes out so that there are no untoward disasters. I wanted to show you another technique with this blob over here. If I take an area like this that has some masking fluid and I lightly rub my finger over it, it makes an interesting texture, and this is quite useful for suggesting things like foam on water. So now all of our resists are dry and we're ready to lay a wash over these areas. And wherever we have a resist, it will do what its name suggests and resist absorbing the watercolor paint. So then when we remove the resist, we'll have a white area left. As usual, I'm using blue just because I want a dark enough color to show up on the video. You can use whatever color or colors you prefer. So now I'm going to lay a wash in this first section just as though that mask didn't even exist. And you'll see the paint beads up on it. When I use my thirsty brush to pick up wash after laying it over a resist, if I have drops like this that are sitting on top of a large area of resist, I go ahead and drink those up with a thirsty brush too, so that they don't escape and run all over something into something I don't want. And now I'm going to do the same thing here. This is where we had the wax. So one of the things that happens with wax is you don't always get complete coverage, and you can't tell exactly where you have good coverage and where you don't. So it's not my favorite technique. In addition, you can't remove this afterwards. It's there forever. But on the other hand, if you wanted just kind of a broken area, that can be kind of interesting. So you'll have to decide. Sometimes it's just the right technique, even though it's not as easy to see where you're putting it. And now I'm going to lay a wash over this part too, in the very same fashion. And the only difference is when I get to the gum arabic, if I go back and forth a lot, I'm going to wind up dissolving it, so I need to be gentle with the gum arabic. Once again, we need to let the washes dry completely before we begin to remove our resists. Our washes over our masking fluid are dry, so we can begin to remove the masking fluid. With masking fluid, it's very important that the paper be completely dry, because otherwise, when you start to remove it, the paper may tear. The surface of the paper dries first, but the paper is thick enough that there could be a layer of moisture underneath, and that layer would be not as strong, so when we start to pull the masking fluid off, the two layers may separate. So we want to make sure this is completely dry. So you can use your finger and just kind of roll the masking fluid off. After a while, that gets rather tiresome, so the tool that most people use is called a rubber cement pickup. Don't scrub too hard. You will actually lift paint if you scrub too hard. So it's more press and lift, press and lift. And this just takes a while. So I'm going to do this entire area of resist. The wax cannot be removed this way. and the gum arabic cannot be removed this way. We have to do those separately. The masking tape, just pull that off. And if it seems to be sticking too tight and you think it might tear, warm it up with a hairdryer and that will soften the adhesive and you'll be able to remove it without tearing. So I'm going to go and remove all of this and then we will talk about how to remove the gum arabic. All right. Now, the gum arabic does not come off with this. It's not rubber. The way to remove gum arabic is to dissolve it. Basically, gum arabic is paint with no pigment in it. So we lift it the same way we lift any other paint, except that because it has no pigment and because it's such a heavy layer of just gum, it will actually lift quite easily. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use this larger brush to just wet this entire area. And you see the gum and the pigment that was sitting on top begins to move. So I want to blot it right away. It's quite sticky, so sometimes your paper towel will tear and you'll think you've torn your paper, but it's actually just a little bit of paper towel. And when you get all the gum arabic off, that little bit of paper towel that's torn will come off too. So blot frequently because I don't want to give that pigment a chance to get back into the paper, and change your paper towel as needed so that you don't put sticky gum arabic back where you just took it off. Now when I get to this outside edge, I think I'm going to switch to my angle shader just because I'll be able to get in here more easily. And you'll see that because I'm softening the gum arabic and that naturally softens a little bit of the paint around the edge, I'm going to get a nice soft edge here on the outside of this, which sometimes for the sun or the moon or a flower petal or something might be just what you need instead of this harder edge. There we go. So as you can see, this resisted the paint, and I have white paper just like I do here, but I have a soft edge around this. So now you know many, many ways to reserve and preserve light edges. As we do the project video, we'll talk about the really hard part, which is figuring out what to do first and what to do next so that you can employ these in a successful way.